Are you most yourself when you are far away, alone in a distant land, or when you are home, surrounded by friends and family? I'm Jay Leeming, and this is the Crane Bag Podcast. Today we're going to continue our exploration of the Odyssey, bringing that wandering warrior Odysseus home to his dear island of Ithaca. It's a beautiful day for this story. Thank you for joining me. Let us begin. We begin in a hut made of white stones. A hut in a muddy field surrounded by pigs in pigsties. The sun has just come up, and it gives to everything a shadow. And Eumaeus the swineherd has spent the night sleeping out there under a stone beside all the pigs to protect them from thieves and wolves. So Eumaeus woke up, and Odysseus, in disguise as a beggar, woke up inside the hut as well. And Eumaeus entered the hut, and the two of them shared bread and cheese and an old apple, and they told stories. And when some time had passed, Odysseus said, "Eumaeus, dear Eumaeus, tell me, how did you come to this place? How did you come to be a swineherd here for that man Odysseus? Tell me how you came to the island of Ithaca." And Eumaeus said, "Oh, stranger, you asked me to open up a box of sorrows. A bitter box it is. Well, I was born the son of a king. The son of a king and a queen. I was destined to be a king, too, to rule over that land, to wear a golden crown, perhaps to live in a vast and marvelous palace. In fact, those are the first things I remember, is a palace, golden statues, beautiful goblets, tapestries. My mother and father, gleaming, shimmering, powerful beings they were. My father was King Ctesias, and that island was Syriae. So I lived there in blissful delight as a young boy, a toddler. And I remember the Phoenicians came. A Phoenician trading ship came and docked in the harbor there, and stayed there a long time. And I had a nurse named Zara, and she cared for me. And one day, she asked me if I wanted to go to the beach. Of course I wanted to go to the beach. I was a little boy, just a little toddler. Of course I wanted to go to the beach. And I remembered later, though I hardly noticed it then, I remembered how she took golden goblets from the table and stuffed them into the pockets of her dress before we left. And we went down to the beach, the crashing sea, sliding up the sand and then sinking back into itself. And there was the great Phoenician ship, a ship with a carved horse's head at the bow, a beautiful boat. And Zara asked me if I wanted to go into the ship and take a look. And of course I did. Of course I did. I had no suspicions, no idea what was actually happening. So she picked me up and carried me into the boat. And I looked at everything, and then she took me down into the hold of the boat. Now they were merchants, so that hold was filled with all kinds of things. Jewels and boxes full of gold pieces, tapestries, amazing statues of cats and horses, golden things. And she found a small wooden horse. It was blue, I remember, and it had green eyes. And she gave me this horse to play with. And so I played with that beautiful blue horse in the hold of that boat. I played for a long while. And when I was done playing, we were far out at sea. For she had fallen in love with one of the Phoenician merchants, and he had promised to bring her back to Phoenicia, for she too was a slave bought by my father years ago from the Phoenicians. So she and her lover, another Phoenician merchant, they were going to sell me in some port as they went back towards their home. But it was not to be. For a few days later, Zara, my nurse, became sick, very sick. And 3 days after that, she died. The arrows of Artemis cut her down. She died of sickness on the open sea. They threw her body from the back of that boat. I remember the smack of that body hitting the water and then drifting down under the waves, and she was gone. And I wept for everything. The loss of my parents, my dear island, my home. I did not know what was to become of me. And some time later that ship docked here at the island of Ithaca, and I was sold to Laertes, and he bought me and gave me the job of caring for these pigs here. So I have a new kingdom, which is this hut, which is this muddy ground, and these grunting, squealing pigs. It could have been much worse. The gods send us all kinds of troubles, do they not? And what can we do but bear them? "Oh, Eumaeus," Odysseus said, "what a sad story you have told. Truly the gods are inscrutable and hard to figure out. They make one man a king, the other a slave. They kill one man just before he gets his greatest victory, and another who has no victories and lives in filth, they let him live a long, long life." So then, Odysseus in rags and Eumaeus, who was the son of a king, they poured wine into their bowls and poured that wine down into the earth to give thanks to the deathless gods. And then the dogs outside began to bark. But this was not a ferocious barking, not a guardian bark. This was a welcome, happy bark. It was a yipping as well, for someone was coming who they liked, who they were glad to see. And Eumaeus heard the barking of the dogs and looked up through the window and said, "Ah, Telemachus! Telemachus is here!" And he jumped up and went outside the house. And Telemachus, Odysseus' son, was indeed there, walking across the muddy ground between the pigsties. And he came outside of the hut there, and he saw Eumaeus, and he said, Papa Eumaeus, so good to see you. Ah, dear boy, dear boy." And Eumaeus embraced Telemachus there. "Ah, dear boy, I was afraid the suitors had cut you down on the open sea." "No, Papa Eumaeus, no. I got good advice from a stranger. I snuck home onto the island through the fog. Good to see you, Papa Eumaeus." And Odysseus, in disguise as a beggar inside the hut, he heard these words, and they went into his heart. "Papa Eumaeus, my boy." And his heart filled with tears, and a cold wind went through him, a wind of absence, of 20 years of absence. And then they came in. Telemachus came in, and Eumaeus. And Odysseus stood up from his bench there to give a place for Telemachus, and Telemachus said, No, stranger, sit down, I'll sit over here." And he sat down, and they all began to tell their stories. Telemachus telling Eumaeus, and Odysseus in rags, of course, about his trip to find out news about his father, and Eumaeus telling him about all that had happened there in Ithaca while he was gone. And then Telemachus said, "Eumaeus, you go to the palace, speak to my mother. Tell Penelope, my mother, that I am home safe and sound, for she must have been worried while I was gone." "Yes, my dear boy, I'll go. And Eumaeus left and went through the muddy field there, and through the forest, and up to the palace, Odysseus' palace. And Telemachus and Odysseus, father and son, though Odysseus was still in disguise, they were there in that hut for a little while, making small talk. And then the cry of an owl came from outside, and Odysseus stood up and went outside. And the birds were hushed because of that sound, and he looked, and there was Athena, and a ripple of strength and power went through every stone and blade of grass around her, for she was one of the 12 deathless gods, beautiful with sea-gray eyes. And she stood and she looked at Odysseus, and she said, "Changing man, now you must become yourself. Now you must reveal yourself to your son here." And she reached out and touched him between his eyes, and the wrinkles faded from his face, and his hair, which had been the color of ash, became dark and beautiful once again. And the rags he was wearing, the muddy, shredded rags, became once again the cloak given to him by the Phaeacians, and he shone golden like a god. And then he turned and went into the hut, and Telemachus stumbled up in surprise. "What god are you? What god are you appearing before me? A moment before you were a ragged man, and now you are this splendid being. Truly you must be one of the deathless ones. And Odysseus said, No, my boy, I'm not a god. I am Odysseus, your father, returned after 20 years. No, said Telemachus, it can't be. After so long, no, you aren't my father. I am your father, said Odysseus. I am the only Odysseus who will ever return to you, my boy. And they looked each other in the eyes, and there was a deep recognition there. And then they embraced each other, and tears trickled down their cheeks, tears of joy and of sorrow mixed and mingled. And when they'd had their fill of weeping, they sat down and they told their stories. And Telemachus told his father about how it had been for him on that island of Ithaca. How it had been growing up with Laertes and Anticlea, his grandparents, and with Penelope, his mother. And then about the suitors who would come, eating the apples and the fruit, and roasting the goats and the chickens and the oxen there, inhabiting that house and devouring all the wealth of that house. And Odysseus told him about the Trojan War, and the cave of the Cyclops, and Circe, and the journey to the land of the dead, and Calypso, and the Phaeacians who had brought him to Ithaca, and how he had come in disguise to that hut there, the hut of the swineherd Eumaeus. And when their stories were done, they began to plan and to scheme and find a way for Odysseus to reclaim his kingdom there on the island of Ithaca. And then in mid-afternoon, Odysseus heard the cry of an owl once more, and he went outside, and there was Athena, and she touched him between the eyes again, and his cloak became ragged, and his hair was like ashes, and he was bent over, and his back hurt, and he went back into the hut and sat down as a ragged old man. And as he sat down, the dogs began to bark and yip happily, for Eumaeus was coming home, walking across the muddy ground between the pigsties. And he came back to that hut and went in the door, and he said, She's finished the shroud. What? Said Telemachus. She's finished the shroud. While you were gone, she finished it. That's impossible, said Telemachus. I know it's impossible, but it's happened. You see, stranger, Penelope, she's had a trick to keep the suitors at bay. She's told them that she would choose a husband only when she was finished with the funeral shroud of Laertes, which she was weaving on her great loom there. So every day she worked on that shroud, making marvelous figures out of the threads, beautiful shapes and colors. But then at night she would rip out those threads, unraveling everything she'd done, all the work, as though she were unraveling time itself, turning back the clock. But the thing is, a servant girl saw her doing this and whispered the secret to the suitors. So, some time ago, they surprised her at night. With torches in their hands, they came, and they surprised her and found her there unraveling all the threads, and they forced her to finish that shroud. So yesterday, she finished that shroud, and now she has no choice. She must break her word, or she must choose a husband from among the suitors. It can't be, said Telemachus. That is what has happened, Eumaeus said. She must choose. If your father's going to come home, he must come home now. There is no other choice. Yes, said Telemachus. May the gods bring him home soon. So they talked, and they ate dinner there, and then night came and spread its darkness over the world, and they all slept. And the next morning Helios went into the sky with his crackling chariot, and the world was filled with light. And Telemachus strapped on his sandals and said, I am going to the palace. I must see my mother, and see her today on this day. Eumaeus, thank you for your welcome. I will see you soon. Goodbye, dear boy. Be careful. Be careful. Those suitors have it in for you. I know, said Telemachus. And he went out the door and across the muddy ground and entered the forest, and went along the hills of Ithaca to the palace. And Odysseus stayed some time in that hut, speaking with Eumaeus. But about noon, when the sun was high in the sky, he said, I'm going to go beg in that palace. What, said Eumaeus, don't do that. There are vicious men there. They're thieves, criminals, and worse. Don't go there. No, I must beg. That is how I live on this earth, said Odysseus. It is my path now. Once I was a man who was of great wealth, but now I have nothing. And so I walk the path of nothing. I beg for my sustenance. That is the path given to me by the gods, and I must follow it." "Well, be careful," said Eumaeus. "I will," said Odysseus. "Thank you for all you've done here to shelter me." And he went out the door, and he walked as well between the pigsties and into the forest. And as he walked, every step he took, he remembered a story there in that ground. For he knew that island deeply, every inch of that place he knew, and he went under Mount Aetos, and below Mount Neriton, and the hill of Hermes, and he came on his winding way, he came to the village of Ithaca, and he saw his house. And outside the door there was the apple tree, he remembered, and beside the door there was a dog. And he looked, and he remembered this dog. It was his dog, Argos. He remembered happy times with that dog, running in the forest, hunting with that dog. But this dog was not doing well. Argos had ticks in his fur, and his fur was not well kept up, and there were flies around. He smelled. He was on a garbage heap, an old, old dog that was not doing well. And Odysseus bent down and put his hand on the flank of that dog, and put his head by the head of that dog, and nuzzled him there. And Argos wagged his tail, and a flicker of remembrance went through him. He smelled Odysseus, and he remembered his master. And a flicker of delight went through his body, and his tail wagged 3 times more, and then he died, and his eyes closed forever. And Odysseus stood up and looked, and there was his doorway. And he remembered that doorway. He'd thought of it when he was being tossed and driven across the sea by a storm, clinging to a plank from his boat. He remembered that doorway, and now here it was. And he had a wooden begging bowl in his hands, and he was dressed in rags. And he took a step, and he went through that doorway and into his house. And he entered that great hall, and it was filled with noise, with yelling and jeering, and chicken bones were on the floor, and people were drinking, and there were empty bottles rolling in the corners of the room. And he looked, and he saw all the suitors there, and he took his begging bowl in his hands, and he began to beg. He went to each suitor, and he gave him the opportunity to be generous. These men who have taken so much, who are practiced at taking the wealth of another, at devouring the wealth of someone else, he gave them all an opportunity to be generous and to give. And they did not take that opportunity. They yelled at him, "Ah, you criminal urchin, out of here! No, you're just garbage! Get out! I won't give anything to the likes of you!" So they yelled at him, and they gave him nothing for his begging bowl. So he went around the room, carefully, methodically, to each of them there. Antinous was the worst. He threw a stool at him and hit his shoulder there, and he said, "You urchin, you parasite, go get a job, do something with your hands, or I'll kill you and dogs will lick your blood. Get out of here, criminal, run, scram!" And Odysseus retreated, moved away, slinked away to the corner of that great hall, and sat down with his empty bowl. And Telemachus came, walking across the room, and he put a crust of bread in the bowl of his father, who was disguised as a beggar. And the others jeered. "Telemachus, that's a waste of good bread. When I am master of this house, boy, I won't have you do things like that, wasting good bread on beggars." And Telemachus said nothing, and turned and walked away. So the day was spent in that hall, in carousing and singing and the throwing of bones this way and that, and gambling as well. And after a while a servant girl came to Odysseus and said, "Stranger, the queen of this house, the lady of this house, Penelope, wishes to speak with you." And Odysseus said, "I am honored to be asked to speak with the queen. But look at me, I am a decrepit, wandering beggar. Tell her I will speak with her after dark. For I would be embarrassed to show my dirt and my rags and my scars before her in the daylight hours." And the servant girl went off and gave the message to Penelope. And time passed, and Helios drove his crackling chariot of the sun down under the rim of the world. And darkness filled the roads of this world, and shadows joined hands and became the night. And then the servant girl came again to Odysseus and said, "Stranger, Penelope, the queen of this house, wishes to speak with you." And Odysseus stood up, and he followed. And he walked across the hall. Now by this time many of the suitors had left and gone home, and the fire in the center of that hall was flickering down. But there were a few suitors left in the corner, still finishing off the last of the wine they were drinking, gnawing on the last of the bones of the goat they'd been chewing on. And Odysseus went, and he saw Penelope there in a beautiful chair, a wooden chair with silver inlaid in all the corners, and beside it was another chair. And Penelope looked like a wise and beautiful queen, for she was a wise and beautiful queen. And she said, "Stranger, have a seat. I wish to hear your stories." And Odysseus sat down in the chair, and Penelope said, "Many wanderers come to this island, and they all have stories. And I have heard, sir, that you have some stories about my husband, so I would like to hear these stories." "Oh, lady," said Odysseus, "it was all so long ago, so long ago. Let me see what I remember. I come from the broad land of Crete, and I served in the Trojan War. Yes, and your husband and I served together there. Not a lot, but I do remember him there in the war. How could I not forget him? Clever man, a resplendent man, like a god in many ways. We all looked up to him. And when that war was finished, I got in a boat with the others, and we sailed away from that horrible place, Troy, that had ruined so many lives. But our fate was to be twisted by the gods, for Zeus sent a great storm down, and it broke our boat upon the waves. We were all wrecked upon the waves, and I clung to a timber and was washed ashore on a distant island. And the people there cared for me. And some time later, a boat appeared in the harbor. It was a black ship, a Greek boat, one of the boats of the Achaeans. I remembered it. It looked familiar. And then Odysseus, your husband, came walking across the sand. He remembered me, and we spoke, and we exchanged stories of the war and of all we had been through. He was there. He was on his way home, but he wanted first to go visit the great magical oak tree at Dodona. For you know, the wind whispers through those branches and speaks with the oracles, the desires, and the plans of the gods. So he wished to learn a few things from this magical tree, to learn whether he should return home in secret as a beggar, or proudly by daylight as a great king. And he told me, after he spoke with this magical tree, he would then return to Ithaca. Well, he stayed there for some time, a few days, and then he and his crew left, and I never saw them again. And Penelope wept to hear this. "Oh, stranger," she said, "it is so good to hear of my husband walking across the sand, to remember that once he was alive in this world. Once he lived. I had thought it was all a dream. But tell me, please, I hear many stories. And no offense to you, sir, but many people make up stories as well. And I just have to know that you really saw him. Can you give me some detail that proves to me you really saw him there in that place? For the memory is a strange thing. It's like clouds drifting away on a sunny day. Perhaps you misremembered it. Perhaps it was someone else. Please tell me. Give me some detail to prove to me you really saw my husband." "Oh, lady," Odysseus said, "it was so long ago. Let me see, though, let me see. Yes, I remember. He came walking across the wet sand. He had on a purple woolen cloak. That was it. A beautiful cloak, yes. And there was a pin, yes. I remember a pin up there holding the cloak together. It was a wonderful medallion. It was a deer and a dog, and the dog was killing the deer. That was it. And the dog had red eyes, and the deer had green eyes, and they sparkled, the two of those animals, as if they were alive. I remember that. I remember that cloak and that pin." "Oh, stranger," said Penelope, "truly you have seen my husband. For I am the one who made that cloak for him, and I put it around his shoulders the day he left for the Trojan War, and I fastened it with that very pin." And he looked at me and he said, "My dear Penelope, war is a chaotic thing ruled by strange gods. It's possible I will not return. If that happens, don't wait too long. Wait as long only as it takes for dear Telemachus here to get a little bit of a beard on his chin. And then you should choose a husband. and you should move in with him and his house and leave our palace to Telemachus to rule over as king of that place." And I said, "No, Odysseus, no. Don't talk nonsense. You will return. The two of us will sit once more in the great hall of our house. We will sit in our chairs there by the fire, and we will tell each other stories of our travels. You will return." And I kissed him goodbye. And he turned and he walked to the shore and got in his black ship, and they took up their oars and they sailed away. But now it seems he was right. Now it seems he will never return, for surely he must be dead and gone. So this story you have told me, it's the last glimpse I will get of that man, my dear husband Odysseus, for truly he is no more. And she wept as she thought these things. And Penelope wept as she spoke. And then she said, "Eurycleia, please wash the feet of this stranger." And Eurycleia came, the old nurse, bearing a silver bowl, and inside the bowl there was warm water, and she had a rag with her. And she came to where Odysseus was sitting, and she sat down on the floor at his feet. And in that moment Odysseus flinched and turned away, for he realized that if Eurycleia washed his feet, she would see the scar in his leg, and she would recognize him to be Odysseus himself. So he flinched and turned away into the shadows, but it was too late. Eurycleia was already putting the bowl down. She was already rolling up his cloak to wash his feet. She was lifting his leg there and looking at the leg, and suddenly she gasped. And she remembered it all. It all came flooding back. Eurycleia remembered standing in that hall itself near the door, and in the doorway was Anticleia, Odysseus's mother. And they looked out, and beneath the apple tree was Laertes, Odysseus's father, and beside him was Odysseus himself, on wooden crutches, with his leg all wrapped up in bandages soaked with blood. And Anticleia said, "Oh, my child, my dear!" And then further back, Eurycleia remembered being in that room, in that very place, by that fire there, in the center of that hall. And Anticleia was there, holding the baby Odysseus in her arms, only a week or two old, and in one of the chairs there was Autolycus, Odysseus's grandfather, father of Anticleia. And Anticleia said, "Father, name the boy, please, today is the day." And she took the baby Odysseus and put him in the lap of her father Autolycus. Autolycus, the wolf himself, he is known as, a great thief apparently. And he looked down at Odysseus, the little baby there, only a few weeks old, and he said, A name, little one. You want me to give him a name? Well, a name is a secret thing. It's how we hide from the world our true natures. So I will give you a name, boy. I name you Odysseus, man of pain." "Oh, father," said Anticleia. "That's the name. That's what the gods did. They put that word into my mouth. So Odysseus is his name." And the little baby Odysseus reached out with his little hands and clutched the beard of his grandfather and held on tight. And Autolycus said, "Little man, someday you will grow up to be a young man, and then you and your father can come visit me at Mount Parnassus, and we will go hunting there, and I will give you many gifts." And Anticleia reached out and lifted the baby Odysseus and held him in her arms. And years later that all came to pass. Laertes and his son Odysseus, they got in a boat and they traveled to Mount Parnassus, that wild and thickly wooded place, and they walked up the side of that mountain to the home of Autolycus, Laertes' his father. And there were many uncles of Odysseus there as well, and one day they went hunting. They had bronze spears with them, and they went out into the shimmer and the whisper of the wild woods there, the wind blowing through the trees, the sun shining down through the green leaves. And they had dogs with them, and the dogs went snuffling along the ground, smelling every inch of that ground. And as they smelled and inhaled the scent of that forest, they learned many things, those dogs, the tracks of raccoons and squirrels and where certain birds had been. And after a while they caught the scent of a boar, And they began to follow that scent very intently, and after a while they were running, and the men came running after them with their spears, and soon ahead they saw a flashing sight, and it was a boar with big tusks running away from all of them, and the dogs began to bark more and more, and they raced after that boar, and then the boar came to a grove of olive trees, young olive trees, and it dashed into the center of that grove, a thick grove, the sun and the rain cannot penetrate it, and then all the men surrounded that grove in a circle, all of them trying to look as fierce as possible, for they knew the boar would rush the one who looked the weakest there among all of them. And then suddenly the boar hurtled out of that grove of trees and went straight for Odysseus and caught him off guard and thrust its tusks into his leg and tore his leg open from the knee up to the groin. And Odysseus plunged his spear into the boar, and the spear went through between the ribs and found the heart of that boar, and the boar crumpled and the light faded from its eyes and it died. And Odysseus let go of his spear and fell to the ground. And in a moment his uncles, his father, and his grandfather were all around him, and they began singing a healing song as they ripped cloth into strips to bandage his wound. There was blood all over him, and Odysseus, still in the swim of shock, looked out and saw the dead boar beside him among the leaves, and then gently he reached out and closed its eyes. And then Laertes and Autolycus lifted Odysseus up, and they carried him through the forest to the house of Autolycus. And he stayed there for about a week, resting up there, healing that wound. And some time later, Odysseus and Laertes said goodbye to Autolycus and all of Odysseus's uncles. And they went down the mountain to the shore, and they rowed in a boat across the water to the island of Ithaca. And then they came from that harbor, Odysseus still on crutches, up towards their house. And there was the apple tree, and there was the house, and there was Anticleia, Odysseus's mother, in the doorway, with Eurycleia behind her. And as Odysseus approached on his crutches, Anticleia spoke and said, "Oh, my child! Oh, my dear!" So Eurycleia remembered all of this in a flash, and she dropped Odysseus's leg into the bowl, and it splashed water everywhere. And Odysseus leapt forward and clamped his hand over her mouth and said, "Silence! Silence, woman! Yes, it is I have returned. But keep it a secret. Keep it an ember in your heart. Tomorrow that ember will flare up and burn this house clean of all the thieves that infest it now. But everything is ruined if you speak." And Eurycleia nodded and said nothing. And Odysseus pulled his hand away. And then Penelope, for she had been distracted. Athena had made the fire blaze up, so she saw none of this. Penelope said, "Thank you, Eurycleia." And Eurycleia wrung out the rag and mopped up the floor and picked up the bowl and walked away into the darkness. And Penelope said, "Stranger, would you like a bed in this palace? Surely we have many guest rooms here. We can find you a place for the night." "Oh no, my queen," said Odysseus. "I am accustomed to aches and pains. Aches and pains are my mattress now. I will find a place here in the hall." "Very well," said Penelope, "but at least we can get you a cloak." And she called to one of her handmaids, who soon brought a warm woolen cloak and gave it to Odysseus. "Thank you, my queen," he said. "You are welcome," said Penelope. And then, accompanied by her handmaids carrying torches, she went up the stairs of that hall and to her chambers. And there Athena showered sweet sleep upon her, and she slept. And down in the hall Odysseus found a place on a wooden bench. There were still a few suitors there, cackling as they finished the last of the wine in the bottles they held. And as their laughter rang out in that dark hall, Odysseus plotted black death for all of the suitors. Remembering their cruelty that day, remembering the looks on their faces, strategizing how he could drive them from his palace and reclaim his place as king of that kingdom. And then eventually the suitors left, tottering home along the pathways of Ithaca. And there, in the great hall, as the last of the smoke from the fire whispered up into the air, Odysseus closed his eyes and slept. All right. Thanks for exploring this story with me. Thanks for giving your attention to it. Stories are perhaps like fires. Your attention is the wood we feed to that story. And we get heat and we get light and we are warm and we feel nourished by that fire. So thank you for doing that. I would invite you to find a moment in this story which jumps out at you, a moment where you want to go, a moment you're drawn to. It can be a difficult moment, it can be an easy moment, a joyful moment, or a harsh, difficult moment. But take a minute and find that place in the story for you. Pause this recording if you need to. And I will do the same. And since I'm the one speaking with a microphone here, I'll tell you where I go. And where I go right away is the singing uncles in the forest on the mountain of Parnassus, when Odysseus is gored by the boar and he's lying there in his own blood. His father, his grandfather, Autolycus, and the uncles all come to him and they doctor him up. And crucial to that is they sing. A healing song, which we could guess lowers his blood pressure and keeps the wound from bleeding excessively, prevents him from losing a lot of blood. And they sing this song, this charm, it is described. You could use that word. I love that image. And perhaps it's because in this story we see examples of toxic masculinity, if I can use that modern phrase. The suitors, who are pretty much the bad side of masculinity, run amok. They take whatever they want, they overstay their welcome, they cross boundaries without thinking about the consequences. And they just eat and drink and take advantage of the hospitality which is by custom due to them, but they take advantage of it. So with that in the background, having these men nourish and heal by their songs is a beautiful thing. And of course, also, there's the background of men who in this story and in our world today are often applauded and encouraged to conquer and kill things, destroy things, be strong, tough, to nourish, to heal. Those are frequently seen as female activities. That's why the men are the doctors, the nurses are the women, right? The caregiving. That's the stereotype. And so here we have men healing through their songs. And I love that. It's very beautiful. And you could perhaps see much of this story as a meditation on what is the role of a man, of masculinity in this world. How does it fit in? How does it fit into the battlefield? How does it fit in to the home? How do you connect those two dots, those two places? How should you behave for the good of all? And sometimes fierceness is required, we might say, in this world, in this life. It's definitely required to defend things that need defending. But the skills of nourishing others, of forgiving, those skills are required as well and equally necessary to the world. And as Odysseus comes home, he is called upon not to be a warrior. He's called upon to be something else. And much of this story is his figuring out what that is, his being schooled in what that is by the various forces he encounters, the goddesses, the monsters, and the human women as well. And one of the skills, one of the things he's required to do in this story, most of all, is to show restraint. He must sit there and take it, be a beggar for days in his own house. He must suffer the abuses of the suitors. So we can ask ourselves when we were beggars, and we can ask ourselves when we had to be nobody. When he was in the cave of the Cyclops, he was nobody for a brief time, for a night. And that was a wise move. It's good to be nobody when there's a giant monster trying to kill you. But then he fails and he declares that he is somebody. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, sacker of cities, Odysseus of Ithaca. He gives the Cyclops not only his name, but his address. This is where I live. This is exactly who I am, which is exactly what the Cyclops needs to curse him in a very particular way. And so Poseidon then brings his anger down, and Odysseus' life is made very difficult. So in that situation, that was not the moment to boast and to gloat. And perhaps he has learned something, or perhaps he still has something to learn, because now here in Ithaca, he must be nobody for a longer stretch of time. To be a beggar in his own house after being away for so long, he was desperate to get home, right? And now he's home, and he's got to hide everything. So we could ask ourselves, why can't he just come in the door and say, I'm home, get out of my house, and be done with it? And that's a good question. We could ask that of the story and of the culture of the time. I think, when thinking of the culture of the time, the ancient Greek culture, which again is a long time ago, 3,000 years ago. So it's very hard to cast our minds back to that. But if I had to guess, I would say that we underestimate the lawlessness of that time period, either in actual fact or in the world of the story. And how are we to know? He might declare himself and just get killed by these suitors, because there are many more of them than there are of him. So they could just kill him. This is a world, a story world at least, where the heroes begin their days. They get up in the morning, they put on their sandals, and they strap on their swords. So it's very Wild Westy. It's very much like justice, what is right, what is wrong, could change, and bad things can happen. That's my sense of this world of the story, and it might be a true reflection of that time in ancient Greece. So those are reasons why, perhaps, he can't just come home and say, I'm here, everybody leave. He has to think up an ambush. He has to physically get them out of his house. So that's one reason why he must show restraint. And then the second is, of course, what I just previously said, as a character developing thing. He must develop his character. He must show restraint. He must learn how to restrain himself. This arrogant warrior who, if you can remember at the beginning of his own story, leaving Troy, after 10 years of war, the first thing he did was to find a city of the Ciconians, allies to the Trojans, and sack that city. As the Odyssey says, he gave the order to kill the men, drag off the women and children and everything of value from this city. So he's a pirate. It's rape and pillage, basically. That's his first instinct. That is what he has been doing in Troy, and that's what he does as an arrogant warrior right away as soon as he's leaving Troy. So now it's years later, he's home, and he must do very much the opposite. He must show restraint. He must hold back. He must turn the other cheek, to use that phrase. He must not strike back at these fellows, the suitors, even though they throw a stool at him, even though they hurl insults at him, even though his own wife is right there, or Eumaeus, who cares for him, who right away mentions him when he gets to Ithaca, like, my master. These would seem to be the perfect opportunities to reveal himself, but he must stay quiet, stay hidden, stay secret for a long time. It's an endurance test. And, well, spoiler alert, but hopefully he passes that test. So those moments call out to me, especially, again, in a world where men are encouraged to be aggressive, to be active, to strike, to do all these active and aggressive things. Here he must just sit and take the punishment for quite a while. And also in this part of the story, it's a meditation on memory, it seems to me, which you could say the entire Odyssey is. But memory comes up a lot in this part of the story. Is he remembered? Now, we remember Odysseus. People have remembered him for thousands of years because of this story. And Odysseus praises storytellers throughout the story. He gives them hunks of meat. When Demodocus, among the Phaeacians, sings of the Trojan War, Odysseus gives him a cut of meat in thanks for singing of that. I don't think I put that detail in my telling, just so you know, but it's there in the original. So memory, this whole story is the victory of memory over forgetting. And as Odysseus comes home to Ithaca, that's the question. Is he remembered? And the answer is yes. Right away, Eumaeus remembers him, remembers my dear master. And then in the house, Penelope remembers him as well. The dog, Argos, remembers. Beautiful, beautiful scene. He is remembered. He still has a home there. If we are forgotten, if we are not remembered, do we even exist? Well, that's the question. So memory is meditated on in this part of the story, it seems to me. Memory and recognition. How is he recognized? How does he prove who he is? Now, the scar is the famous detail, and that's how he proves definitively who he is. Telemachus, however, gets no such proof. He must simply take his word for it. This is your father. I am your father. And there's that beautiful scene, and he says, I am the only Odysseus who will ever come home to you, which I find very sweet, especially because it sort of implies there are other Odysseus's, either in Telemachus' own mind or in Odysseus' own mind. And we have seen him become many different people. He can be a beggar, he can be a king. Who is he exactly? Who is he really? Is he a warrior? Is he a husband? Who is he? We see him as a baby in this story as well. No other Odysseus will ever come home to you. It's beautiful. It's like Odysseus is shoving aside all those other selves and saying, this is who I am. I'm your father. And then we get the scar with Eurycleia bathing his feet and finding the scar, which is just an amazing little collection of stories. I love that moment. It's, if I can get technical for a moment, it's just a marvelous example of what storytelling is capable of doing. I don't think you could film that and have it be as sort of intoxicating as it is for me anyway, in hearing it, perceiving it in this way. And it is not my construction. I mean, I'm telling it, but it's in the original, the same sort of nested narratives there. And technically speaking, this is called ring composition. It's a form which you find in oral literature from around the world. And it's basically, the form is A, B, C, B, A. You go towards a memory and then back out again, leaving by the same trail you took to get there. So, for example, you might say, it was a beautiful sunny day. I was on the beach. I got into the water. It was warm. I swam through the water to the old rowboat anchored there out in the middle. And I climbed on board that rowboat and I found a green shell in that rowboat. And I looked at it for a while, the sun glimmering on it, and then I dove back into the water. I swam back through that warm water back to the beach, and I looked around. It was a beautiful sunny day. So we start in one place, the beach. We go to the water. We get to the heart of the matter, more or less, which is the boat and the shell. Then we return through the water back to the beach. This is a ring composition. Things happen in rings, patterns like rings or ripples in a pond when you throw a stone in. And perhaps our attention is that stone making this pattern. I was told this existed in oral literature, and to be honest, it sounded a little artificial to me at first. But then I began to encounter it in the Odyssey over and over again, and I began to see how well it works. And I began to look at my own telling of ordinary stories just on an average day. And I saw that often we speak that way. You know, how was your day at work? Oh, well, it was this way. It was this way. That happened. So-and-so yelled at somebody. I even had to clear out a paper jam, and it was a rough day, and that was my day at work. You know, you tell these narratives, and they sort of naturally fall into this pattern often, it seems to me. So that's what this is called, is ring composition. Eurycleia sees the scar, remembers Odysseus coming home under the apple tree, remembers further back to him getting his name, remembers too the incident itself, the boar, the spear, a story she was told by Odysseus, the wound, and then they come back across the water under the apple tree. There they are again. There's Anticleia. Oh, my child. Oh, my dear, once again. It's a beautiful circular pattern, quite lovely. And it is perhaps, like I say, that is perhaps how we remember. That's a deeply biological pattern, perhaps, of how we remember events in our lives and in the world. And so I would invite you into this story. And it is It is your story as much as mine. It is our story. Go in by any door you want. Go into the forest of this story and find where it feels right for you to be. I think of being a beggar. I think of coming home. For me, I've had moments like that in my own life. I have said this before, I believe, on this podcast, but I studied poetry in New York City for a time, and I would work in Midtown Manhattan as a temp, and then go take classes at Greenwich Village at New School University in the evenings. And I felt like I was nobody there in Midtown Manhattan at Rockefeller Center in some big office. My tie and my shirt wasn't as cool as the others there because I was a temp. I didn't want to spend the money. I didn't have a suit on. I was just the temp, nobody. And if they had asked me, and sometimes they did, what are you doing here in New York? I rarely told them I was studying poetry. Because in that environment, I just wasn't confident that it would be received well. I thought I would get strange looks like, poetry, huh? What are you doing that for? What's poetry anyway? Now, I might have been wrong about that. But that was my perception. So I kind of wanted to be nobody there because I felt fearful in that environment. I was not at home there. I was earning money and then getting out. And then I'd go to Greenwich Village, and honestly, I'd feel out of place there as well. Even though that world was much more to my liking, I would feel that now I had the tie on, the shirt on. I'd take off my tie often, and I would look like a more conservative person than the folks around me there in Greenwich Village. So that's how I felt. I guess you could say, oh, look at that guy. He's just never at home anywhere. And I would say that is in part a link to Odysseus. Is he at home anywhere? He's always got a different story. He's from Crete. He's a carpenter. He's a potter. He's a warrior. Why does he wander so much? Why does he travel the world so much? He is delayed from getting home, but does he like to wander? Does he really know who he is, this guy? That's the thing. He's tricky. He's clever, especially in this latter half of the story. He can become almost anybody he wants to be. But is he at home being who he really is? That's the question. And it's possible there is a deep homelessness there at the heart of this character, which is beautiful in some ways because it sends him out into the world to experience more, to understand more. It sends him out into realms of the mind as well, to learn from Circe, for example. But if he were truly rooted in a place, if he were truly at home, he would not need to wander so much. He would not need to have such a lengthy catalog of selves to draw from. So we in the West, that's perhaps why we like this story, because perhaps we are rootless as well. Living as we do, those of us in America, on Turtle Island, not knowing the stories here, being out of place, being wanderers that we are. Perhaps that's why this story sings in us. And, I just don't mean to, this show isn't about me, but I'm the material at hand. And if your stories connect with this story, I would love to hear those. If you want to send me them or get in touch some way. But I returned to Ithaca, New York, where I live. When I was 33, my dad was dying, and then he died. And I got a job at the local food co-op in the produce section, stocking out potatoes, onions, bananas, things like that. I remember at midnight, after my shift was done, being in my car, which had been my dad's car, but he no longer drove, and just weeping with despair because I felt I had come to nothing. And it's a very stark thing when you're back in your hometown. It's like people can see you. Oh, there's the Leeming boy. What became of him? Oh, well, he works at the co-op, stocking apples, onions, potatoes. I felt that was not my true calling, even though it was a good job, such as jobs are. I felt I was destined for greater things. Part of that is my family upbringing. Part of that is America, which tells us we can do great things. We can become the president, whatever. It's the land of endless opportunity. But part of it is just honest, good, healthy desire to be more than just this kid from Ithaca, New York, to be something larger and greater. It's extreme sometimes, that desire, but we need that. Teenagers especially need that. We need the heights to aspire to, whatever they are, and they are multitude. But whether you want to be a singer, a famous this, a famous that, an astronomer, a cosmologist, a rapper, whatever you want to be, we need those aspirations for higher things. So I returned at 33 and felt kind of like a failure. Felt like I was nobody. There I was in my ragged cloak, in my dad's car, not my car, working for whatever an hour at the co-op. And I felt kind of lost. So that was a rough homecoming for me, to return to Ithaca and be a beggar, basically, in the eyes of some folks who saw me grow up, and they're like, oh, what became of him? Well, now I go to the store, I buy my groceries, and he helps me out with them. He puts them in the bag for me. So that's a moment which was difficult for me, which connects me to this story. Because Odysseus comes home, and he's a beggar. And inside there's a voice which says, I'm a king. And I've had that voice as well. And I think we need that voice. I am a king. I am a queen. I deserve more than this. We want to be satisfied, but we want to also aspire. And we are born for great things. So perhaps we should listen to that voice. All right. Do you know this poem? This is A Story That Could Be True by William Stafford, the poet from Oregon, deceased now, but wrote some wonderful poems. I think this speaks to this moment. A story that could be true. If you were exchanged in the cradle and your real mother died without ever telling the story, then no one knows your name. And somewhere in the world your father is lost and needs you, but you are far away. He can never find how true you are, how ready. When the great wind comes and the robberies of the rain, you stand in the corner shivering. The people who go by, you wonder at their calm. They miss the whisper that runs any day in your mind. Who are you really, wanderer? And the answer you have to give, no matter how dark and cold the world around you is, maybe I'm a king. Let's do that one more time. Poems are reusable. If you were exchanged in the cradle and your real mother died without ever telling the story, then no one knows your name. And somewhere in the world your father is lost and needs you, but you are far away. He can never find how true you are, how ready. When the great wind comes and the robberies of the rain, you stand in the corner shivering. The people who go by, you wonder at their calm. They miss the whisper that runs any day in your mind. Who are you really, wanderer? And the answer you have to give, no matter how dark and cold the world around you is, maybe I'm a king. That's William Stafford, A Story That Could Be True. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Thank you for exploring this story with me. May it live in you. May it live around us, as stories are meant to do. There are more stories on my website, which is jayleeming.com, JAYLEEMING.com. And many thanks to the Patreon supporters out there who help to make this podcast possible. If you are able to join them, please do so. There's a link to that on my website. Take care and be well.